At 8:15 on the morning of December 19, 1944, Sergeant William "Buck" Anderson pressed his chest into frozen Belgian soil and watched 300 German soldiers draw the ring tighter around his position. 31 years old, Montana Elk Hunter. 15 winters reading wind in the Rockies. The 40 remaining men of Easy Company had been surrounded since dawn, cut off 2 miles behind the German advance, ammunition running low, radio dead. German forces had locked them inside a forest clearing with machine guns positioned between the trees and mortar crews already zeroed on the open ground. Anderson's captain had called his plan reckless the moment he heard it. The platoon sergeant said firing at individual targets from 400 yards would burn through the last of their ammunition for nothing. His fellow soldiers said a man who hunted elk in Montana had no business deciding how infantry survives a siege. When Anderson had laid out his idea that morning, Captain James Walsh asked him flatly whether he understood what the words ammunition discipline meant. Anderson told him he'd spent 15 years making 400-yard shots in wind that would stop most men from aiming at all. Walsh told him hunting and combat were entirely different problems. Anderson kept his rifle across his forearms anyway. The Germans were working methodically, probing the American line at intervals, pushing patrols forward, testing where the defenses were thin. They stayed beyond 350 yards, well outside the practical range of most infantry weapons. Safe, they believed, positioned to tighten the noose at their own pace. But Anderson was carrying an M1903 Springfield fitted with a scope, effective range, over 600 yards, and he had spent 15 years putting elk down at 500 yards in Rocky Mountain crosswind. German soldiers standing in Belgian snow were slower targets than elk crossing an open ridge. Easy Company had still been advancing through the Ardennes on December 18th when the German offensive struck without warning. Panzers, artillery, infantry flooding through the forest in waves, the whole weight of the German winter counter-offensive rolling west across a 50-mile front, American lines fractured, battalions scattered. Easy Company lost contact with their regiment during the chaos and kept moving until the sound of German voices surrounded them on 3 sides. By nightfall on the 18th, and they had gone to ground in a forest clearing 2 miles behind enemy lines. 40 men, limited ammunition, no way out and no way to call for help. Captain Walsh gathered his remaining NCOs before dawn for an emergency meeting with no good options. Break out through German-held forest with wounded men and risk being overrun in the open, or dig in, hold the clearing, and hope American reinforcements arrived before the Germans decided to stop probing and simply attack in force. Walsh chose to hold, dig foxholes, conserve every round, wait. Anderson had carried his 1903 Springfield from the moment the company shipped out, ignoring every order to leave it behind and draw a standard Garand like the rest of his unit. The Springfield weighed 8 pounds, 12 ounces unloaded, with his scope adding another pound to the balance. Or the M1 Garand issued to every other man weighed just over 9.5 pounds, but offered no magnification, a semi-automatic action, and an effective combat range of roughly 300 yards. The Springfield was bolt action, 5 rounds, slower to reload. But through that scope, 400 yards looked like 200. Walsh had already decided to hold the clearing. Now the question was whether 40 men and their ammunition could last long enough for help to reach them. Anderson had a different question. The Germans were standing at 380 yards, believing they were untouchable. Were they? Hello, my beautiful family. If you're listening to this story, please do me a favor and subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second, but means the world to me. Also, comment where you're watching from below. Now relax and enjoy this story. December 16th, 1944, had started as a quiet morning. Along an 85-mile stretch of the Ardennes forest, American units occupied defensive positions they had held for weeks. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector. Dense woodland, narrow roads, difficult terrain. Not the kind of ground where armies launched offensives. Military planners on both sides understood that. The forest swallowed movement, choked supply lines, and turned any large-scale advance into a logistics nightmare. The Germans understood all of that. They had chosen it deliberately. At 5:30 in the morning, more than 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the entire front. American soldiers who had been sleeping in farmhouses and frozen foxholes woke to a sound that many later described as the world coming apart at the seams. The ground shook. Trees splintered. His entire defensive positions disappeared in the first minutes of the barrage. Then, out of the fog and the darkness and the driving snow, the infantry came. 3 German armies, more than 400,000 soldiers, pushed west through the Ardennes in a massive coordinated assault. At the spearhead were the armored divisions of the 6th SS Panzer Army, punching through the American line with tanks, half-tracks, and infantry moving in columns that stretched back through the forest for miles. The objective was the Meuse River, and beyond it, the port of Antwerp. If they reached it, they would split the Allied armies in two and force a negotiated peace before the Soviets reached Berlin. It was Adolf Hitler's last gamble, planned in complete secrecy over months, launched in conditions deliberately chosen to ground Allied air power and hide German movement. For the first 48 hours, it worked. American units along the front received the initial reports with disbelief. Commanders studying their maps couldn't reconcile what they were hearing with what intelligence had told them for weeks. German forces were retreating. Their army was exhausted. Their fuel reserves were depleted. An offensive of this scale wasn't possible, but the reports kept coming, and they kept getting worse. Entire regiments lost contact with their headquarters. Supply lines were cut. Isolated units found themselves fighting in multiple directions at once, unable to reach anyone on the radio, unable to confirm where the German advance ended and their own lines began. In the confusion and the snow and the dark, the front didn't so much collapse as dissolve. Not a clean break, but a disintegration, units becoming islands, then disappearing. Easy Company had been moving east through the Ardennes on December 17th, attached to a battalion tasked with reinforcing a defensive line that, by the time they reached it, no longer existed. The men had been marching for most of the night through ankle-deep snow, equipment heavy, visibility near zero in the blowing winter storm. What should have been a straightforward movement to an established position became something else entirely as the sounds of artillery shifted from ahead of them to behind, then to both flanks. Their battalion commander ordered a halt and tried to raise regiment on the radio. Silence. He tried again. More silence. The radio operators cycled through frequencies, adjusting equipment. Running checks. The sets were working. There was simply no one answering. Somewhere to the east, the American front had ceased to function as a coherent line, and no one in Easy Company's column knew exactly where the edges of the German advance were or how far it had pushed. What they knew was that the sounds of tank engines and German voices were getting closer, and standing still in the dark waiting for a radio response was no longer an option. The battalion commander made the decision to pull back west and find a defensible position to wait out the night. The retreat through the forest on the night of December 17th into the 18th was the kind of thing men spent years trying to forget. There were no landmarks in the dark, no roads wide enough for vehicles, no way to move quietly when every step broke through a crust of frozen snow with a sound like cracking glass. The men carried everything: rifles, ammunition, rations, wounded soldiers on improvised stretchers cut from pine branches. Officers navigated by compass in the dark under a cloud cover that blotted out every star. At some point during the night, Easy Company lost contact with the rest of the battalion. It happened the way things often happened in the chaos of those hours, gradually, then completely. A gap opened in the column during a halt while scouts pushed forward to check a road crossing. When the column moved again, the gap had become a separation. The rear element of the company ahead of them had turned down a different track in the dark, following a route that split away at a junction nobody had marked on a map that was already wrong. By the time Captain Walsh realized his company was moving alone, they had been separated for nearly an hour. He tried the radio again. Nothing. They kept moving. The clearing appeared just before first light on December 18th. It was roughly 200 yards across, an open space in the forest with several collapsed farm structures at the western edge, surrounded on three sides by dense tree line. Not ideal ground for a defensive position, but it offered something: visibility. In the darkness of the forest, visibility was everything. Walsh ordered the company to stop, sent scouts in a full perimeter sweep, and waited. The scouts came back with bad news delivered in the flat tone of men who had stopped being surprised by bad news. German troops on the northern approach. Vehicle sounds from the east. Movement in the trees to the south. The exact boundaries of the German advance were impossible to confirm, but every direction the scouts had checked showed signs of enemy presence somewhere in the forest. To the west, nothing. Open forest. No confirmed enemy contact. But the wounded were slow. The men were exhausted. Moving through open forest in daylight with an unknown number of German units in the area meant risking a collision in the open with no cover and no prepared position. Walsh looked at his remaining ammunition count and made the calculation that most infantry commanders in the Ardennes were making that week. Movement was risk, position was risk, and the only honest choice was to pick the risk that gave you the most control. He chose the clearing. They spent the remainder of December 18th doing what soldiers do when there is nothing else to do. They dug. In frozen ground that required two men trading off with the same entrenching tool to make any progress. They cut pine branches for overhead cover. They positioned their two remaining machine guns at the northern and eastern edges of the clearing where the approaches were most open. They checked and rechecked their ammunition and said nothing when the count came back worse than anyone had hoped. Anderson cleaned his Springfield. Nobody said much that night. The cold had dropped below freezing, and the wind moved through the trees with a low sound that occasionally made men grip their rifles before they caught themselves. Patrols went out and came back. The radio operators kept trying frequencies and kept receiving nothing. And somewhere to the east, artillery rumbled in long, rolling exchanges that had been going on without stopping for 2 days. Walsh held his officer and NCO meeting at 2200 hours, crouched around a map laid on a fallen log. The situation required no elaborate briefing. 40 men, 2 machine guns, ammunition for a sustained firefight of perhaps 2 to 3 hours at normal rates of fire, 1 radio that reached nobody, no confirmed friendly positions within reach, an unknown number of German units between them and the American lines. The options were what they were: breakout west, moving wounded through forest, where any German patrol could turn a march into a firefight they couldn't win, or hold the clearing, dig in, conserve ammunition, and trust that the American army would organize a counter-offensive fast enough to push a relief column through before the Germans found them and decided to finish the job. Walsh chose to hold. Most of the NCOs agreed with the logic, if not with any enthusiasm. Anderson said nothing during the meeting. He had already made his own decision earlier that evening when he'd field stripped his Springfield for the second time and laid out his remaining ammunition in careful rows on the folded canvas of his pack. He counted the rounds, put them back, and thought about wind. The clearing was open to the northwest. In the morning, the light would come from the east, which meant anyone moving against them from that direction would be silhouetted against the dawn for a few minutes before the sun climbed high enough to make it irrelevant. He thought about the distances. He thought about the tree line, which was thick enough to conceal assembly, but not thick enough to give real cover to a man standing upright. He thought about elk in an open alpine meadow, moving along the far tree line, 480 yards out, a crosswind from the left at 8 miles an hour. He thought about how patience had always been the difference between a clean shot and a wasted round. Walsh told his men to rest in shifts and be ready by first light. Nobody slept much. When dawn came on December 19th, it came grey and cold and without drama. The men in the foxholes along the eastern edge of the clearing heard it before they saw it. The sound of boots in frozen snow. Then voices, low and distant, carrying in the cold air through the trees. The scouts pulled back from the perimeter and reported what every man in the clearing already understood was coming. German soldiers were moving into the tree line, not a patrol, a force. Within an hour, they had completed their estimate. More than 200 confirmed. Machine gun positions visible to the north and east. Mortar crews setting up in the trees to the south. German officers visible at the woodline, studying the clearing through their own binoculars, taking their time. They had all morning. They had all day if they wanted it. And 40 exhausted Americans in a frozen clearing had, by Captain Walsh's arithmetic, perhaps 2 to 3 hours of ammunition if the fight went the way fights normally went. It was 8:12 in the morning. Anderson was already prone in the snow, his Springfield resting on the trunk of a fallen birch, his eye behind the scope. He found the first target 3 minutes later. The Germans were not in a hurry. That was the first thing Captain Walsh noticed as the morning light strengthened through the trees. A unit planning an immediate assault moved differently, rushed, compressed, committed to momentum. What Walsh was watching through his binoculars was something more deliberate. Soldiers moving carefully between tree trunks, pausing, signaling to one another, spreading laterally along the wood line rather than pushing forward. Officers consulting maps, NCOs pointing and adjusting positions. This was an encirclement being constructed with patience. They weren't attacking yet because they didn't need to. By 8:30 in the morning, the picture had become complete enough to understand in full. German forces had taken up positions along 3 sides of the clearing, north, east, and south, in a rough semicircle that left the western approach technically open but practically useless. The western tree line dropped away into a shallow ravine that any scout could tell you was crossable on foot, slowly, in small numbers, by men who weren't carrying wounded. A fighting withdrawal west, through that ravine and into open forest, against a pursuing force 3 times their size in daylight. Walsh had run the calculation the night before, and he ran it again now, and arrived at the same answer both times. The Western Gap was not an escape route. It was a killing ground with better lighting. 2 German MG-42 machine gun positions had been identified, one in the tree line to the northeast, one anchored behind a low rise to the south. The MG-42 fired at roughly 1,500 rounds per minute, a rate so high it produced a sound less like mechanical fire and more like tearing cloth. One of those guns covering the open clearing could pin every man in easy company flat in their foxholes within seconds of an assault beginning. 2 of them, positioned on diverging angles, created overlapping fields of fire that left almost no dead ground anywhere in the open. The mortar crews were visible further back in the trees, setting up their base plate equipment with the unhurried efficiency of men who knew they were out of rifle range. Walsh counted at least 2 mortar positions, possibly 3. He lowered his binoculars for a moment and looked at the clearing his company occupied, the shallow foxholes hacked into frozen ground, the sparse overhead cover, the open space between positions. Against mortars, a foxhole bought you something, not much, but something. Against a coordinated assault with machine gun support, what you had in this clearing was a time problem, not a defense problem. The question wasn't whether they could be overrun. The question was, how long before it happened? Walsh raised his binoculars again and kept counting. The American defensive line, if it could honestly be called a line, ran along the northern and eastern edges of the clearing in a loose arc of 11 foxholes, spaced roughly 15 yards apart. The 2 machine guns were positioned at the corners where they could cover the most open ground. Riflemen occupied the foxholes between them with orders to hold fire and conserve ammunition until targets were close enough to make every round count. That last instruction was the problem. A German infantry had advanced to the woodline and stopped there, moving laterally along its edge, probing, occasionally stepping into the open long enough to observe the American position before stepping back into cover. The range from the American foxholes to the woodline ran between 320 and 420 yards, depending on the section. Across open, snow-covered ground, that distance looked manageable. In practice, with a standard M1 Garand, it was the edge of a cliff. The Garand was a reliable weapon. It had served American soldiers well across every theater of the war. At ranges under 300 yards, in the hands of a trained infantryman, it was accurate and effective. Beyond 300 without magnification, against a man-sized target that wasn't standing still, the odds dropped sharply. Beyond 400, in winter light, against soldiers who were moving between trees and rarely presenting a full profile for more than a few seconds, the Garand was essentially decorative. The Germans knew this. Their officers had positioned the patrols with precision, keeping movement at ranges they understood were outside the practical engagement envelope of American standard infantry weapons. It wasn't arrogance. It was applied knowledge of the opposing force's equipment. They had fought Americans before. They understood what the Garand could do and where its limits were. They stayed well outside those limits, and they prepared their assault positions without interference. Walsh watched a German NCO stand fully upright at the wood line, 380 yards out, and spend nearly a minute pointing toward the American positions before stepping casually back into the trees. Not hurrying, not ducking, simply a man doing his job at a distance he had correctly assessed as safe. Walsh lowered his binoculars. "They know exactly how far away they are," he said to nobody in particular. Sergeant Anderson was lying prone 15 feet to Walsh's left. His Springfield laid across the birch trunk he had selected that morning for precisely this purpose. A rest at the right height, stable, positioned with enough cover on either side to break his outline from the wood line. He had been behind the scope for the better part of an hour. He had watched the same German NCO stand at the wood line. He had watched the mortar crews work. He had tracked a German officer who had moved between 3 different positions in the last 20 minutes, each time pausing long enough in the open to observe, then moving on. Anderson had ranged each position by eye, cross-referencing against landmarks he had already estimated during the first grey light of dawn. A gap in the tree line at approximately 340 yards, a darker mass of spruce at roughly 410, the low rise where the Southern machine gun was positioned at just under 400. He watched the wind in the upper branches of the tree line. Light, northwesterly, 4 or 5 miles an hour at most. In the Rockies, he had made shots in gusts twice that strength. Walsh turned to look at him. Anderson spoke quietly. He told Walsh the Germans were operating at distances that felt safe to them, and that for every rifle in easy company, they were right. He said the man who had been standing at the wood line directing troops believed himself to be completely unreachable. He said the mortar crews setting up in the trees were working in the open without taking cover because nobody had given them reason to think they needed to. Walsh studied him for a moment. He had already told Anderson twice that morning to hold fire and conserve ammunition. He had already made the broader point, patiently, as a commander explains policy to a sergeant who keeps testing its edges, that long-range speculation with their remaining rounds was precisely the kind of luxury they could not afford. Anderson told him he wasn't speculating. Walsh asked him what he thought he could do. Anderson said he thought he could make the Germans stop moving like men who believed they were safe. He said that a force that stops moving, starts hiding, and loses its officers is a force that takes longer to organize an assault. He said every hour of delay was an hour closer to relief. Walsh looked back at the wood line. The German NCO had reappeared at the same position, standing, pointing again, 380 yards, unhurried. Walsh thought about 2 hours of ammunition. He thought about the machine guns in the tree line. He thought about 40 men in shallow foxholes against a coordinated assault with mortar support, and what the clearing would look like in an hour if nothing changed. He turned back to Anderson. He told him he had until noon to prove the idea was worth the ammunition. Anderson was already adjusting his position against the birch trunk. He exhaled slowly, found the scope, and the forest went quiet around him as he settled into the particular stillness of a man who has done this 10,000 times before, not in war, but in cold mountain mornings above the tree line, alone, with the wind reading steady and a target that didn't know it was being watched. He found the German officer at 382 yards. He steadied the crosshairs, and he waited for the moment that everything becomes simple. Before the war, William "Buck" Anderson had never been difficult to find. Most mornings between September and November, he was somewhere above the tree line in the Bitterroot Range, moving through country that didn't appear on any map worth carrying, tracking elk across slopes where the wind came off the peaks in cold, unpredictable currents that changed direction 3 times in 100 yards. He had grown up in the kind of Montana that people who haven't been there tend to romanticize and people who have tend to describe simply as hard. Winters that arrived in October and didn't release their grip until May. Distances between neighbors measured not in blocks but in hours. A landscape that rewarded patience and attention and punished the assumption that any day outdoors would go the way you planned. His father had taken him hunting for the first time at 9 years old, not as sport, as instruction in how the family ate through February. The first lesson, delivered on a frozen hillside above the Bitterroot River with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned it the same way, was this: the shot is the last thing. Everything before the shot, the reading, the waiting, the understanding of what the animal will do before it does it, that is the work. The shot is just the conclusion of a long argument you've already won. Anderson had spent the next 15 years refining that argument. Long-range shooting in mountain terrain is not a single skill. It is a collection of separate disciplines that have to function simultaneously and automatically, the way a musician plays without thinking about the mechanics of each finger. Distance estimation, wind reading, elevation adjustment, breath control, trigger discipline, understanding how cold affects both the shooter and the rifle, how freezing temperatures change a barrel's point of impact, how numb fingers lose the sensitivity that distinguishes a proper trigger pull from a flinch. Anderson had learned all of it by necessity, in conditions that did not allow for comfortable margins of error. An elk at 500 yards in a Montana crosswind is not a forgiving target. It moves unpredictably. It presents a full profile for a few seconds and then turns or steps behind a tree or starts across the slope at a pace that requires the shooter to lead the target and calculate the intersection of bullet trajectory and moving animal in a fraction of a second. Miss, and the animal is gone. Miss, and the work of the stalk, sometimes hours of slow movement across open ground, becomes nothing. By the time Anderson was in his mid-20s, he had developed a reputation in his county as the kind of shooter other hunters called when the country got difficult. Not the closest shot or the easiest. The one where the elk was already moving at 400 yards in failing afternoon light with a wind off the ridge that changed angle every 30 seconds. The one other men looked at, made their honest calculation, and passed to someone better suited for it. He guided hunters from outside Montana for a decade before the war. Men from cities who arrived with expensive rifles they hadn't practiced with enough, and expectations shaped by stories that had traveled further than the facts behind them. Anderson guided them with patience, the same patience the mountains had built into him, and on the days when the shot was beyond them, he took it himself cleanly, at distances that quietly recalibrated what his clients thought a rifle could do in the right hands. He had carried the M1903 Springfield since his second year of guiding. It was not a new rifle even then. The design dated to the early years of the century, are a bolt-action weapon that had served American soldiers through the First World War before being largely replaced by the semi-automatic Garand in the years leading up to the Second. What it offered that the Garand did not was a naturally longer sight radius, a smoother trigger pull, and, critically, a mounting system compatible with magnified optics that had been refined across decades of use by target shooters and military snipers alike. Anderson had fitted his with a Unertl scope. The combination added weight and a bolt-action slower follow-up shot, and he understood both limitations with clarity. But at 400 yards and beyond, the scope turned what would have been an act of optimism into an act of precision. He could read his target. He could see the wind moving through the animal's coat, or in Belgium, through the fabric of a German field jacket. He could see with certainty whether his shot had arrived where he'd placed it. The M1 Garand issued to every other man in easy company fired more rounds faster and needed no bolt manipulation between shots. In a close-range firefight, at the distances where most infantry combat was decided, it was the superior weapon. Anderson did not argue this point. He had never argued it. In the forests of the Ardennes, in fog and darkness and at ranges of 50 yards, he would have traded the Springfield without hesitation. But this was not 50 yards. When Anderson had first raised the idea of long-range fire on the night of December 18th, the reaction had been what he'd expected. The platoon sergeant had spoken first, on with the blunt efficiency of a man who had been in the army long enough to distrust any plan that sounded like something from a magazine. He said that firing at individual soldiers at 400 yards with a bolt-action rifle was a romantic notion and not a military tactic. He said it would burn ammunition they didn't have for results nobody could count on. He said the sound of each shot would tell the Germans exactly where their position was, and if they hadn't already found it by map, they'd find it by muzzle flash soon enough. The other NCOs had offered variations of the same argument. It was not hostility toward Anderson specifically. It was the reasonable skepticism of men whose experience had been built at combat ranges where the Springfield's advantages were simply irrelevant, or they had learned to fight at distances where the Garand worked and where a bolt-action's slower rate of fire was a meaningful liability. The idea of turning that calculus around, of finding a context where Anderson's rifle was not the worse option, but the only viable one, required a reframing that felt, in the cold and the dark and the exhaustion of their situation, like wishful thinking. Captain Walsh had put the question plainly. He asked Anderson what he actually expected to accomplish, not in theory, in practice in the morning, against a trained enemy force that would adapt the moment they took their first casualties. Anderson had thought about it for a moment. He said he expected to make them stop moving like men who believed they were safe. He said an officer who can be shot at 380 yards will not stand in the open to direct his soldiers. He said a mortar crew that takes casualties at 400 yards will start thinking about the shooter before they think about their targets. He said that every minute a force spends reorganizing around unexpected fire is a minute it isn't attacking. Walsh had told him to get some sleep, and they would discuss it in the morning. Anderson had cleaned his Springfield instead. He had gone over the scope mounts, checked the bolt, run a patch through the barrel, and laid out his ammunition with the quiet, methodical attention of a man settling into something familiar. It was the same process he went through before every difficult hunt. Not superstition, not ritual, but the practical discipline of eliminating every variable he could control before committing himself to the ones he couldn't. The wind, the light, the distance, everything else he could manage. In the frozen clearing on the morning of December 19th, with the scope to his eye and a German officer visible at 382 yards, Anderson was not thinking about the argument from the night before. He was not thinking about the platoon sergeant's objections, or Walsh's skepticism, or the 40 men in their foxholes waiting to find out whether his idea would hold or collapse. He was thinking about the wind in the upper branches, still northwesterly, light, consistent for the last 4 minutes, which in his experience meant it would hold for another 2 or 3 before the morning air began moving differently as the temperature shifted. He was thinking about the natural point of aim, the way the rifle rested against the birch trunk, whether the contact points were stable, whether his body was aligned behind the stock without tension that would translate into movement at the moment of the shot. He was thinking about the target, a man standing at the wood line in a gray-green field jacket pointing toward the American position. 382 yards, unhurried, safe. Anderson's right index finger settled against the trigger with the same measured pressure it had applied 10,000 times before on cold mornings above the tree line, with the wind reading steady and the shot already decided. He exhaled halfway and held. The scope made the world smaller. That was the first thing Anderson had understood about it, years before Belgium. On a granite slope above the Bitterroot, with his father's voice still in his ear and the wind coming cold off the peaks. At 400 yards with the naked eye, a man sees a shape, a presence, something that might be a target or might be a shadow, depending on the light and the angle and how long you've been awake. Through the Unertl, 400 yards compressed to something legible, a jacket collar, a hand gesture, the specific way a man holds his shoulders when he believes he is not being watched. The German officer had been in and out of Anderson's scope for the better part of 20 minutes. He had a deliberate quality to his movement, not cautious, but measured, the way a man moves when he is doing his job competently and without urgency. He would appear at the woodline, study the clearing, point toward specific positions within it. I speak to soldiers. Anderson could only partially see in the shadows behind him, then step back into cover. The intervals between appearances were irregular, which meant Anderson couldn't anticipate them and had to simply wait, eye behind the scope, breathing slowly until the officer reappeared. Waiting was not a problem. Anderson had waited longer than this for elk that never showed. At 8:19, the officer appeared again at the same position, a natural gap in the tree line where 2 large spruce grew close enough together to provide cover on either side, but left a clear channel of view toward the clearing. He was carrying a map case under one arm. He raised his other hand and pointed north toward the MG-42 position, then swept his arm in an arc toward the eastern approach, directing the assault sequence, and Anderson tracked him through the scope and checked the wind. The upper branches of the spruce at the woodline were moving slightly, a steady drift from the northwest, less than 5 miles an hour. In the last 15 minutes, it had not changed direction or increased in strength. Cold air in flat terrain tended to move with more consistency than the mountain winds he had built his understanding on, which meant the drift he was reading now was likely the drift he would be working with when the shot broke. At 382 yards, a 5-mile-an-hour crosswind from the northwest would push a .30 caliber bullet approximately 3 to 4 inches off a zero wind point of impact. Less than the width of a man's chest. Manageable. He held the crosshairs and adjusted his natural point of aim slightly left, into the wind. The officer was still pointing, explaining something to a soldier partly visible behind him, not moving, not aware. Anderson's cheek rested against the stock with the even, relaxed pressure that meant the rifle was truly part of him, rather than something he was holding. His right hand curved around the grip without tension. His left hand cupped the stock where it rested on the birch trunk, not gripping, simply supporting, adding no torque, no directional pressure, nothing that would walk the point of impact away from where his eye told him it was. He breathed in, breathed out, took a partial breath and stopped. The firing of a rifle, done correctly, is not an action. It is the cessation of action, the removal of all the small, muscular tensions that had been holding the shot back. Or Anderson had explained this once to a client from Chicago who kept jerking the trigger and sending rounds 6 inches below his point of aim. He had told him that the trigger doesn't fire the rifle. The trigger releases it. The shot is already there, waiting. The shooter's job is simply to stop preventing it. The client had thought about this for a long moment and then asked if Anderson had always been this strange. Anderson had told him to try it again. The client's next shot had been 2 inches from center at 300 yards. At 8:23 in the morning on December 19th, 1944, Anderson stopped preventing the shot. The Springfield fired. The sound cracked across the clearing, sharp, singular, nothing like the rolling exchanges of automatic fire that the men had grown accustomed to over days of combat. Several soldiers in nearby foxholes flinched involuntarily at the unexpected break in silence. Walsh turned his head toward Anderson's position. Through the scope, Anderson watched the officer drop, not stumble, not reach for the tree. Drop, the instantaneous collapse of a man whose body has ceased to function between one moment and the next. The map case spun away into the snow. The soldiers behind him were visible for half a second, frozen in the kind of absolute stillness that precedes understanding. And then they vanished, diving sideways into the trees, pressing against trunks, flattening themselves to the frozen ground. The gap in the spruce was empty. The wood line to the north went quiet. For approximately 4 seconds, nothing moved anywhere along the German perimeter. Then it moved all at once. Soldiers who had been standing at the wood line dropped into crouches or pressed themselves behind trees. A figure to the northeast, Anderson had noted him earlier, a squad leader by his movement patterns, sprinted from one position to another in a low, urgent run that carried nothing of the casual confidence from 20 minutes prior. Voices rose briefly in the trees to the south, sharp and clipped, and then dropped to a register that didn't carry across open ground. The mortar crews, visible earlier, working in the relative open beyond the tree line, pulled back further into the forest. Walsh was watching through his binoculars. "He's down," he said quietly, to no one. Anderson had already worked the bolt. Smooth, practiced, suit the motion of a man who had done it standing in wind and sitting in mud and lying flat on frozen ground and had never once fumbled it. A fresh round was chambered. He scanned the wood line through the scope, reading the new pattern of movement, marking where the remaining officers and NCOs had gone to ground. The battlefield had changed in the time it took a map case to fall into the snow. What Anderson had understood, and what the German officer's death now demonstrated in terms that required no translation, was that the psychology of an encirclement depends on a specific assumption. The assumption is asymmetry. The surrounded force is visible, bounded, running out of options. The encircling force operates in the covered ground, controls the timing, and faces no meaningful threat from outside the range of the weapons it knows the enemy carries. Remove that assumption, and everything changes. Not the numbers. The numbers were the same, 300 against 40, the same machine guns, the same mortars, the same arithmetic that Walsh had been working since dawn. What changed was the invisible line the Germans had drawn around themselves, the perimeter of safety beyond which they had been operating freely and without cover, and which had just been erased. A man was dead at 382 yards. The new question, the one now running through every German soldier who had watched that officer fall, was where the line actually was. In the foxhole, 15 yards to Anderson's right, Private Danny Kowalski from Pittsburgh had watched the wood line shift from casual occupation to sudden cover-taking and was working through what he had just seen. He had been in the army for 2 years. He had fought in Normandy and across France and into the Ardennes. He understood, at an instinctive level shaped by experience, the difference between suppressive fire that made men duck and fire that made men genuinely reconsider. He had just watched 300 soldiers reconsider. He looked over at Anderson, who was already back behind the scope, scanning unhurried, reading the new positions the way he read a hillside after a shot, noting where things had moved, calculating what the movement meant, deciding where the next moment of opportunity would appear. Kowalski turned back to his own rifle and said nothing, but he pulled it a little tighter to his shoulder. The radio operator had been trying frequencies in rotating sequence since before dawn, and at 8:26, 3 minutes after Anderson's first shot, he tried again and got static that briefly resolved into something that might have been a voice, before dissolving back into noise. He reported this to Walsh with the cautious optimism of a man who had been disappointed by radios before. Walsh acknowledged it without taking his binoculars from the wood line. The Germans were regrouping. He could see the adjustments being made, soldiers moving with more care, patrols pulling back from their forward positions, the easy lateral movement along the wood line replaced by shorter, faster movements between trees. The advance had not stopped, but its character had changed. They were no longer moving like men who were safe. They were moving like men who were being watched. Walsh lowered his binoculars. To his left, Anderson fired again. The second shot came at 8:31. A German soldier had broken from the tree line at the northeastern edge of the clearing, moving in a low sprint between two positions, the kind of short, fast movement that infantry learn early because it works at normal combat ranges, where the time a man spends exposed in a 10-yard dash is too brief for most riflemen to track, acquire, and fire accurately. Anderson had been watching him for 40 seconds before he moved. Not the soldier specifically, The pattern, the way traffic between two positions develops a rhythm when men believe the movement is safe, the pause before committing, the same route taken twice, the moment when caution relaxes into habit. He had watched the same thing in elk moving between feeding ground and tree line. The second crossing was always faster than the first. By the third, they stopped checking. He had been waiting for the second crossing. The soldier covered 4 yards before Anderson fired. He was down before he reached 6. For a long moment after the second shot, the wood line produced no movement at all. Then the voices started. Anderson couldn't hear the words from 380 yards, but he had spent enough time in mountains and in forests to read sound through distance, the difference between the clipped exchange of men coordinating movement and the louder, less organized sound of men trying to understand something that had just become urgent. What carried across the clearing in the cold morning air was the second kind. Questions, not orders. Walsh heard it too. "They're trying to figure out where it's coming from," he said quietly. Anderson had already considered this. His first shot had come from behind the birch trunk at the eastern edge of the clearing's defensive line, which put the muzzle report somewhere between the American foxholes and the open ground. At 382 yards in still air, the crack of a .30 caliber rifle carried clearly and offered directional information to anyone experienced enough to use it. The Germans would triangulate eventually. They had soldiers who knew how to find a sniper's position, and given enough time and enough shots from the same location, they would find his. He had identified 3 secondary positions before dawn. He would move to the first of them after the next shot. The third came at 8:44. A figure had appeared at the southern wood line, the edge of the perimeter where the second machine gun was positioned, and stood partially exposed behind a pine trunk, watching the clearing with binoculars. The exposure was perhaps 30% of a full profile. Left shoulder and arm visible, part of the face, the binoculars catching a brief reflection of winter light that confirmed the position in the distance. Anderson ranged him at 401 yards. At that distance, the wind drift calculation shifted slightly, requiring another half-inch of hold into the wind. He adjusted, held his breath, and broke the shot in the same unhurried way he had broken the first 2. Not fast, not slow, simply at the exact moment when everything was correct, and waiting any longer would have introduced variables rather than removed them. The figure dropped the binoculars and stepped back hard into the trees. Anderson wasn't certain of the result. The partial profile and the cover made it impossible to confirm what the shot had done. But the man had not reappeared at that position for the next 20 minutes, and 2 soldiers who had been visible behind him immediately flattened themselves against the ground and didn't rise. He gathered his rifle and moved to the first secondary position without being told to. By 9:15 in the morning, the wood line had transformed. Where German soldiers had been moving laterally between positions with the practical confidence of men operating beyond reach, they now moved in short bursts between trees, crouching low, choosing routes that kept timber between themselves and the clearing at all times. The easy, upright posture of soldiers conducting an encirclement on their own schedule had been replaced by something that looked, through Walsh's binoculars, much more like the defensive behavior of men under observation. Nobody was standing in the open. Nobody was pointing toward American positions from the wood line. The mortar crews had pulled back far enough that Walsh could no longer locate them from his position, which meant they were either preparing to fire from deeper in the forest or had been ordered to hold until the situation was better understood. Either way, the methodical preparation for assault that had been underway since dawn had slowed to something he could only describe as hesitancy. He watched a German NCO attempt to organize a movement between two positions to the north. The man gestured toward 3 soldiers, pointed toward a gap in the trees, and waited. The soldiers looked at one another. One of them looked at the open ground between the trees and the gap. Nobody moved. The NCO gestured again, more sharply. After a long pause, one soldier went, running low and fast, covering the ground in a few seconds, pressing himself against a tree trunk at the far side and staying there. The others followed one at a time, with gaps between them, each man moving with the compressed urgency of someone crossing ground they are not sure is safe. 30 minutes earlier, that movement would have been casual. Walsh lowered his binoculars and looked at Anderson's second position, a shallow depression behind a cluster of pine trunks 20 yards north of the birch, where a rifle barrel rested almost invisibly against the gray bark. The Germans sent a patrol at 9:30. 4 soldiers, moving through the trees parallel to the clearing's eastern edge, rather than toward it, a search pattern, not an assault, designed to locate the sniper's position by moving through the ground where the shots had appeared to originate. They moved carefully, rifles up, spacing themselves wide enough to cover ground without bunching. Anderson watched them through the scope from his second position. They were in the tree line, moving north to south at roughly 340 yards, which put them inside the pattern of his previous shots, but not in any position that required an immediate decision. He tracked the patrol and waited. They stopped twice, once where his first shot had been fired, once further south where the trajectory of the second would have appeared to originate, and spent time studying the ground, looking for brass, looking for disturbed snow, looking for any physical evidence that would fix his location. They found nothing useful. He had been lying in snow that had been undisturbed since before dawn, and he had moved before the pattern of his fire became readable. The birch trunk told them nothing except that someone had rested a rifle against it, which confirmed what they already knew. The patrol pulled back into the trees and disappeared. Anderson remained still for 4 minutes after they were gone, watching the area where they had exited before he settled back behind the scope and returned his attention to the woodline. By 10:00, the count stood at 6 confirmed. 3 officers, or NCOs, 2 soldiers caught in movement between positions, 1 probable, the partial profile at 401 yards who had not reappeared. Anderson had used 11 rounds. He had fired from 3 different positions, each time moving after no more than 2 shots from the same location, each time settling into the next prepared position with the patient efficiency of someone executing a plan rather than improvising one. Walsh had watched every shot. He had also watched what happened between shots, the incremental changes in German behavior that accumulated across 90 minutes into something that was beginning to look, improbably, like paralysis. The machine gun to the northeast had not fired. The crew was in position. Walsh could still identify them by occasional movement behind the rise, but no order had been given to open up, and without covering fire from the machine guns, a full infantry assault across open ground was a different calculation than it had been at dawn. Officers who would have given that order were dead or in cover. Officers who replaced them had watched their predecessors fall at distances nobody had briefed them to expect, and were now working from a revised understanding of the risk attached to standing upright in the clearing's sightlines. That revision was worth more than the 6 confirmed casualties. At 10:20, Kowalski spoke from his foxhole without looking away from the woodline. He said it had been 45 minutes since any German had moved in the open. Walsh didn't answer immediately. He was watching the forest, the stillness of it now, the way 300 soldiers had been absorbed into the trees and gone quiet. The entire weight of the encirclement somehow rendered motionless by a man with a bolt-action rifle and 15 years of practice reading wind. The clearing that had felt, at dawn, like a trap was beginning to feel like something else. Not safe, not rescued, but contested. One rifleman had redrawn the perimeter of what the Germans were willing to do, and the assault that had seemed inevitable 90 minutes ago had not yet begun, and every minute it didn't begin was a minute closer to the distant artillery that Walsh kept listening for in the west. To his left, Anderson fired again. 7. By 11 o'clock in the morning, Anderson had developed a system. It was not complicated. Systems that work under sustained pressure rarely are. The complexity is in the execution, not the design. In the 1,000 small decisions that have to be made correctly and consistently across hours when fatigue accumulates and the temptation to simplify grows proportionally with exhaustion. The system had 3 rules. The first, never fire at a target of opportunity when a target of consequence was available or likely. A soldier crossing open ground was a target of opportunity. An officer organizing the next assault was a target of consequence. The difference between killing a private and killing the sergeant directing him could be measured in hours. Hours of confusion while the chain of command reorganized, hours of hesitancy while soldiers waited for someone to tell them what to do next, hours of delay that Anderson was converting, one careful shot at a time, into distance between easy company and being overrun. The second rule, never fire more than twice from the same position. The Germans were competent soldiers with experienced NCOs, and every shot Anderson fired gave them acoustic information they were actively trying to process into a grid coordinate. 2 shots from one location was risk he could manage. 3 was a pattern. Patterns got men killed. The third rule, conserve. Count every round. Know the number at all times. The ammunition he had laid out on his pack canvas that morning was finite in a way that everything else about the day was not. The Germans could reorganize, reposition, rotate fresh soldiers into the line. His rounds could not be replaced. Each one had to do the work of 2. He had begun the morning with 60 rounds. By 11 o'clock he had 37 remaining and 9 confirmed. The Germans had not been passive. At 10:40 they had attempted a flanking movement to the south, a squad of 8 soldiers pushing through the forest parallel to the clearing's edge, moving wide of the established perimeter to find a line of approach that Anderson's previous shots had not covered. Or Walsh had identified the movement from the sound of it before the scouts confirmed it visually, the particular noise of a squad moving fast through frozen underbrush, not trying to be quiet, prioritizing speed over concealment. Walsh repositioned 2 riflemen to the southwestern foxholes and told them to hold fire until targets were inside 200 yards. Anderson moved to his 3rd prepared position, a fallen spruce at the clearing's southern corner that gave him a sight line into the forest approach, and waited. The squad made it to approximately 280 yards before the lead soldier stopped at the edge of a small, frozen creek bed and raised his fist to halt the column. Anderson watched him through the scope. The soldier was reading the ground, looking at the creek bank, calculating the crossing. Or an officer or experienced NCO, the decisiveness of the halt, the way the others stopped immediately and went to cover without being told, indicated someone they trusted. Anderson shot him at 280 yards. The column fractured. 3 soldiers went left into the trees, 2 went right, 2 dropped flat at the creek bank. Nobody crossed. After 4 minutes of silence, the soldiers at the creek bank pulled back the way they'd come, moving fast and low, and the flanking movement ended at the frozen creek. Walsh heard the shot from across the clearing and didn't lower his binoculars. "Southern approach," Anderson reported, settling the rifle against the fallen spruce. Walsh acknowledged it and returned his attention to the northern wood line. The artillery came at 11:35. 2 shells, fired from a German position somewhere deep in the eastern forest, landing in the clearing's center in rapid succession. The first round hit 30 yards north of the main foxhole line, sending a column of snow and frozen earth into the cold air. The second landed closer, 15 yards, and the concussion moved through the ground in a wave that Anderson felt in his chest, even from the southern corner. The men in the foxholes stayed down. Anderson moved. He had identified a 4th position during the first hour of the morning, a section of the western tree line where 3 pine trunks grew in a cluster tight enough to break a silhouette from the east, while still offering a narrow sight line back across the clearing and into the northeastern woodline. It required crossing 40 yards of open ground to reach, which meant timing the movement against the German observation pattern he'd been reading all morning. He went low and fast, the same way he moved above tree line when the wind dropped and the elk were watching. No hesitation at the start, no slowing at the finish, committed to the movement from the moment it began. He reached the pines without drawing fire. Behind him, 2 more artillery shells landed in the clearing. Then, silence. The Germans were bracketing, trying to locate the American defensive line's center of mass. Standard procedure before a ground assault. Walsh ordered the men deeper into their foxholes and reported the shelling to the radio operator, who was still cycling through frequencies with the patient futility of a man who has accepted the work without accepting the outcome. By noon, Anderson had been behind the scope for nearly 4 hours. The eye fatigue was real, not incapacitating but present, a dull ache behind the right eye that he managed by periodically closing both eyes and resting against the stock for 60-second intervals. He had done the same thing on long stalks when the sun was wrong, and the glare came off snow at angles that made sustained observation painful. The technique worked in Montana. It worked here. The count stood at 12. Not all confirmed kills. He was honest with himself about this, as he had always been honest with himself about shots that he could not verify fully. 3 of the 12 were probable rather than certain, soldiers who had fallen or retreated behind cover in ways that could indicate a hit or could indicate a man diving away from a near miss. He counted them separately in his head. 9 confirmed, 3 probable. What he knew with certainty was that 11 of the 12 had been officers, NCOs, or soldiers in positions that indicated leadership function, men directing movement, men organizing flanking approaches, men standing at the wood line, coordinating between positions. The 12th had been the soldier at the creek bed, chosen because stopping that flanking movement was worth breaking the pattern. Walsh had reported to him at noon that the northern machine gun had still not fired. Anderson had noted this. An MG-42 crew that had been in position since before 8 o'clock and had not fired after 4 hours was either waiting for a specific order or waiting for the situation to clarify enough that the order made sense. Or both explanations led to the same conclusion. Someone was making them wait. Someone in the chain of command had decided that opening up the machine guns was a commitment that couldn't be undone, and that the situation on the ground hadn't yet justified making it. That someone was being careful. Anderson intended to keep making careful feel like the right instinct for as long as his ammunition held. A second patrol came at 12:40. Larger than the first, 6 soldiers moving through the eastern forest in a 2-element pattern, one group advancing while the other covered, leapfrogging forward through the trees in a technique designed specifically to locate and fix a sniper position. They were moving more slowly than the first patrol had, which told Anderson they had learned something from the morning. They were spacing themselves further apart, which told him the earlier patrol had reported back with useful information. They were checking their rear regularly, which told him they were aware this was not a safe assignment. He watched them through the scope from the cluster of pines and did not fire. Firing would fix his position precisely, which was what the patrol was designed to produce. Silence was the correct answer, not because the targets weren't there, but because the cost of engaging them was higher than the cost of letting them pass without finding what they were looking for. They swept through the eastern edge of the tree line for 20 minutes, found nothing actionable, and pulled back. Anderson watched them go. 2 minutes after they disappeared, he moved again, back to his second position, the shallow depression behind the northern pines, resetting the pattern in case the patrol had managed to narrow down the quadrant he'd been firing from. At 1:15, he fired his 16th round of the day. A German officer had appeared at the northeastern wood line, the same gap in the spruce where the first shot had been taken that morning. Perhaps a different man doing the same job, perhaps someone who hadn't been told not to stand there. Anderson tracked him for 90 seconds, confirmed the wind, confirmed his own position against the stock, and broke the shot at 374 yards. The officer went down. In the foxhole to his right, Kowalski had stopped tracking this by reaction. He noted it the way men note things that have become part of the landscape, a fact of the day, like the cold, or the sound of artillery in the east that had been growing steadily louder since mid-morning. He turned to the soldier beside him and said quietly that he thought they might actually get out of this. The other soldier said nothing for a moment. Then he said he'd believe it when he saw the relief column. But he was looking at the wood line differently than he had been at dawn, not with the tight, inward focus of a man rationing his hope, but with something that had, cautiously, across 6 hours of precise and patient fire, begun to resemble expectation. At 1:47 in the afternoon, the forest went quiet in a way that was different from all the silences before it. Anderson noticed it first, not the absence of movement. The wood line had been largely still for the better part of an hour, the Germans having learned across 6 hours of accumulated cost that casual exposure in the clearing's sight lines was a category of risk they could not afford. This was something else. The ambient noise of the forest, the occasional distant voice, the sound of equipment shifting, the sporadic creak of soldiers moving between positions, had stopped, not reduced, stopped. He had heard this kind of silence before, not in Belgium, in Montana, above the tree line, in the seconds before elk that had been feeding quietly suddenly lifted their heads and stood absolutely still, processing information their instincts had registered before their eyes confirmed it. It was the silence of something about to move. He pressed himself lower against the stock and began scanning the wood line in a slow, methodical sweep from north to south. Walsh, 30 feet away, had heard it too. He lowered his binoculars and turned to his remaining NCOs with the quiet efficiency of a commander who has already made his decisions and is now simply executing them. "Stand to," he said. "Everything we have." The artillery came first. 3 shells in rapid succession from the eastern battery, landing across the northern foxhole line with a precision that told Walsh the Germans had been adjusting their fire all morning, waiting for this moment to use the corrected data. The first round hit the ground 10 yards north of the line. The second landed closer. The third, Walsh heard it coming before it landed and was already flat, struck the frozen earth 6 yards from the nearest foxhole, close enough that the soldier inside it came up bleeding from the face, or not from shrapnel, but from the frozen ground that the concussion had thrown against him like gravel. He stayed in his foxhole. Then the machine guns opened up. Both of them simultaneously, the MG-42 to the northeast and the one on the southern rise, raking the clearing in long traversing bursts that sent snow and dirt fountaining from the ground in continuous lines. The sound was extraordinary, a mechanical tearing that filled the clearing completely and made communication impossible above a shout. American soldiers pressed flat against the forward walls of their foxholes and returned fire where they had targets, which was not yet everywhere. Then the infantry came out of the trees. They came from 3 directions at once, north, northeast, and southeast, in a coordinated rush that had clearly been rehearsed and timed. Not a disorganized charge, but a disciplined assault, soldiers moving in bounds, some advancing while others provided covering fire, the whole mass of it pushing across the open ground toward the American line in a controlled wave that absorbed its own casualties and kept moving. Walsh estimated 60 soldiers in the initial assault wave, more in the tree line, waiting. The American machine guns opened up immediately, and for the first 30 seconds the defensive fire was effective. The open ground between the wood line and the foxholes gave the gunners clean sight lines, and the advancing soldiers took casualties and slowed. But slowed was not stopped, and the German machine guns continued their suppressing fire, keeping American heads down between the moments when they could rise to aim. Anderson was already moving. He had anticipated that the final assault, when it came, would require him to abandon the careful patience of the morning's work. The distances were collapsing as the assault advanced. Soldiers who had been at 380 yards were now at 300, then 250, then less, moving fast, presenting brief profiles rather than the sustained exposures he had been working with all day. This was no longer long-range precision work. This was something faster and more urgent, and it required a different application of the same fundamentals. He looked for leaders. The first thing a coordinated assault needs to maintain its momentum is command. Anderson had spent 6 hours demonstrating what happened to momentum when command was removed, and he applied the same logic now with the same deliberate targeting priority, simply faster. He was not shooting at the mass of advancing soldiers. He was shooting at the specific men within it whose deaths would cost the assault more than their numbers suggested. He found the first at 290 yards, a soldier moving behind the main assault wave, not advancing himself but directing it, pointing left and right, adjusting the line's spacing and direction. An officer or senior NCO managing the assault's shape in real time. The kind of man who keeps a coordinated attack from dissolving into a mob when it takes casualties and loses its initial momentum. Anderson shot him at 290 yards and worked the bolt without watching him fall. He found the second 30 seconds later, a soldier at the northeastern edge of the assault wave who had stopped and turned back toward the tree line, gesturing urgently toward the follow-on forces waiting there, calling the second wave forward, trying to get more men into the assault before the American defensive fire could consolidate. Anderson shot him at 240 yards. The second wave did not come out of the trees. The assault reached 180 yards before it began to lose its shape. American riflemen in the foxholes were firing continuously now, aimed shots where targets presented themselves, suppressive fire when they didn't, burning through the ammunition reserves Walsh had been protecting all morning, with the understanding that this moment was what they had been saved for. The 2 machine guns worked in short, controlled bursts, prioritizing the densest concentrations of advancing soldiers and the flanking approaches, where a breakthrough would be most dangerous. The German machine guns were still firing, but their traverse had become less precise as the assault wave moved forward, and the risk of hitting their own soldiers increased. The suppressing fire that had been most effective in the assault's opening seconds was degrading as the geometry of the attack changed. Anderson kept finding leaders. A third at 210 yards, a soldier rallying a group that had gone to ground 20 yards short of the American line, getting them back on their feet, pointing toward a gap between 2 foxholes. Down. A fourth at 195 yards, visible for 2 seconds, moving fast between positions, something in his movement and bearing that registered as command even at distance and in motion. Anderson led the target by a body length and fired. The soldier went down sideways. His ammunition count was running critically low, or he had begun the assault with 19 rounds remaining. He had fired 8 in the last 4 minutes, 11 rounds. He selected each target with the cold arithmetic of a man who knows exactly what he has left and exactly what each round needs to accomplish. The assault faltered at 160 yards. It didn't stop all at once. It stopped the way a wave loses its force on a shallow beach, not a single moment of reversal, but a gradual dissipation, the forward energy bleeding away as the soldiers at the front found themselves taking fire from multiple directions without the command structure to organize a response. 3 men went to ground and didn't rise. A group to the northeast that had been pushing toward the gap between foxholes slowed, took casualties, and pulled back 15 yards to a shallow depression, and the follow-on wave still hadn't emerged from the tree line. Anderson found a 5th leader at 200 yards, a man who had appeared at the wood line's edge, shouting toward the soldiers who had gone to ground in the assault's middle, trying to restart the forward momentum from the rear. Standing upright, voice carrying across the noise, The 10th shot of the assault dropped him where he stood. The shouting stopped. In the assault wave, the soldiers who were still moving looked back toward the tree line and found no one there telling them to go forward. They looked at the ground between themselves and the American foxholes, littered with the men who had made it furthest, and they made the individual calculation that collective momentum had been sustaining for them until it wasn't. The advance stopped. For approximately 8 seconds, the clearing held a strange, suspended stillness, the assault neither moving forward nor moving back, the assault wave frozen at 150 yards while the question resolved itself. Then a soldier turned back toward the tree line. Then another. Then the retreat was general, not panicked, not routed, but deliberate and without hesitation, soldiers pulling back across the open ground toward the tree line with the focus of men who have made a decision and are executing it. The German machine guns shifted their fire to cover the withdrawal, and American fire followed the retreating soldiers until Walsh called a ceasefire and conserve. The clearing went quiet again. Not the preparatory silence of the early afternoon, a different silence, emptier, without the compressed potential of what had been sitting in the woodline all morning. Walsh rose slowly from behind his foxhole's forward wall and looked at the open ground between the clearing and the tree line. He looked at the men in the foxholes, alive, exhausted, checking their ammunition with the focused attention of soldiers who have just found out exactly what they had and used nearly all of it. He looked at Anderson, who was lying still behind his position at the northern edge, the Springfield motionless, watching the tree line through the scope with the same even patience he had maintained since 8:15 that morning. "How many rounds?" Walsh asked. Anderson checked without moving his eye from the scope. 3, he said. Walsh said nothing for a moment. Then, from somewhere far to the west, distinct and unmistakable through the winter air, came the sound of American artillery, moving east. The sound of American artillery moving east is one of those things that soldiers who have heard it in the right circumstances never forget. Not because it is particularly distinct. Artillery sounds like artillery, regardless of which direction it's traveling or whose uniform is firing it. What makes it different is the context. When you have been in a frozen clearing for 9 hours with 40 men and 3 rounds of ammunition left, listening to that same sound from the wrong direction all day, the moment it shifts, the moment the thunder starts coming toward you instead of at you, registers somewhere below conscious thought, in the chest, behind the sternum. Walsh heard it at 2:34 in the afternoon. He stood up from behind the foxhole wall without thinking about it, which he noted later with some embarrassment was not the behavior of a cautious officer, and listened with his whole body toward the west. No question. American 105mm howitzers, multiple batteries, the overlapping reports of a fire mission being walked forward in a pattern that indicated an advance rather than a static defensive action. Someone to the west was pushing east. Someone was coming. He turned to his radio operator. "Try again," he said. The Germans heard it too. Anderson was watching the tree line through his scope, 3 rounds remaining, eye steady, the same patient scan he had maintained across 9 hours, when the movement began. Not an assault, the opposite. Soldiers visible in the shadows between the trees, moving laterally, east to west, gathering equipment, pulling back from forward positions. The machine gun crew to the northeast, the one that had never fired, the one Walsh had been watching since dawn, broke down their weapon with efficient, practiced speed and disappeared into the forest. The mortar crews, visible briefly in deeper forest, were already gone. What Anderson was watching through 400 yards of winter air and the cold glass of his scope was a tactical withdrawal executed by a force that had decided the arithmetic of the situation had changed. They had come into the Ardennes on a timetable, moving west with a strategic objective that had no room for a prolonged engagement with a surrounded unit that was about to become unsurrounded. The artillery to the west told them what they needed to know. The American counter-offensive was organizing faster than expected, and the window in which this clearing could be taken without the risk of being caught between two forces had closed. They pulled back with the same methodical discipline they had shown all day. Within 20 minutes, the northern wood line was empty. Within 30, the southern perimeter showed no movement. Walsh's radio operator, cycling through frequencies for what felt like the 1,000th time that day, found a signal at 2:51 that resolved into a voice that resolved into a call sign that Walsh recognized as a battalion frequency he had been trying to reach since the night of the 18th. He grabbed the handset. The relief column reached the clearing at 4:20 in the afternoon. It came from the west, the direction Walsh had chosen not to attempt when the choice had been his. A reinforced infantry company with 2 half-tracks and a forward artillery observer who had been calling fire missions since before noon to push the German advance back enough to open the route. They came through the ravine that Walsh had looked at the night before and called a killing ground, which it still was, technically, except that the killing was now going in the other direction. The lead soldier of the relief column was a sergeant from Wisconsin who had been fighting across Belgium for 6 weeks and had developed the particular economy of expression that extended combat produces in men who have stopped spending energy on things that don't matter. He looked at the clearing, at the foxholes, at the 40 men who were standing up from their positions for the first time in hours, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said they had been looking for Easy Company since yesterday morning. Walsh told him Easy Company had been right here. The Wisconsin sergeant looked at the open ground between the clearing and the tree line, at what the ground between them contained, and then back at Walsh. He asked how many men Walsh had. Walsh told him 40, same as when they'd gone in. The counting took 2 days. Military investigators attached to the relief force moved through the contested ground methodically, recording what could be recorded, estimating what could not. The German forces had taken their dead and wounded with them during the withdrawal. Standard practice, and evidence of a disciplined retreat rather than a rout, which meant the full accounting depended on ground evidence, trajectory analysis, and the testimonies of Easy Company's soldiers about what they had witnessed across 9 hours of engagement. The final tally attributed to Anderson's rifle fire was 23. 11 confirmed kills verified by ground evidence and corroborating witness accounts. 7 additional probables assessed as confirmed after trajectory reconstruction and the location of impact evidence in the forward ground. 5 more assessed as probable based on witness testimony and the pattern of the day's engagement. The investigators noted that the number was almost certainly conservative. The withdrawing German force had taken considerable time removing casualties, and an unknown portion of the engagement's full effect had left with them. 23 at ranges between 230 and 410 yards across 9 hours, using a bolt-action rifle with a scope and a starting load of 60 rounds. 57 rounds expended, including the 3 Walsh had asked about after the assault. Anderson had fired every round he had started the day with except 3, and the 3 he had kept were not sentiment. They were the last margin between a defensive position and a position with no defense at all, held in reserve until the moment when the German assault either broke or reached the foxholes. It had broken. Captain Walsh wrote his after-action report 3 days later in a farmhouse outside Liège with a cup of coffee that he noted in a letter home was the best thing he had consumed in 6 weeks. The report was careful and precise, which was Walsh's nature, and it documented the engagement in the factual language that military reports require. But at the end of the operational summary, before the casualty figures and equipment status, he wrote a paragraph that his commanding officer later described as the most straightforwardly honest assessment he had read in 20 years of reviewing combat reports. Walsh wrote that Sergeant Anderson's marksmanship had been the primary reason Easy Company had survived the engagement on December 19, 1944. He wrote that the effect of long-range precision fire on the German force had not been primarily in the casualties produced, though those had been significant, but in the psychological and operational disruption that had compelled a force of nearly 300 soldiers to conduct a conservative, a hesitant siege, rather than the immediate coordinated assault that their numbers and position had made possible. He wrote that the engagement demonstrated something that infantry doctrine had not yet adequately addressed, that a single marksman with the right equipment and the right skills, properly employed, could exercise an influence on a battlefield disproportionate to any reasonable calculation of force ratio. He recommended Anderson for the Distinguished Service Cross. Anderson received a commendation. The difference between what was recommended and what was awarded was a paperwork problem that outlasted the war and was never resolved to anyone's particular satisfaction, least of all Walsh's. Anderson himself did not appear to find the distinction meaningful. He had been asked about it once, years later, by a historian researching the Battle of the Bulge, and had said only that he hadn't been there for the commendation. He had been there because 40 men needed to get home. He went home himself in the autumn of 1945 on a transport ship that docked in New York on a grey October morning. He took a train west, then another, then a bus, and then a man he had known since childhood picked him up at the depot in his truck and drove him back into the mountains without asking very much about where he had been or what he had done there. By November, he was guiding hunters again. The Bitterroot Range does not change quickly. The same ridgelines Anderson had hunted as a boy were the ridgelines he walked in the years after the war, the same wind patterns moving through the same draws, on the same distances opening up below the tree line across alpine meadows where elk moved in the grey early light. The clients who hired him in those years, businessmen from Chicago and Denver, and occasionally from the East, men who had read about elk hunting in magazines and arrived in Montana with expensive equipment and insufficient patience, came back year after year because Anderson was the best guide in the county and because something in his manner, a quality of steadiness they couldn't quite name, made the mountains feel manageable in his company. He rarely spoke about the war, not because it pained him, or not only because it pained him, but because the distance between what had happened in that clearing on December 19th and the life he was living in the Bitterroots felt impossible to bridge in language that made sense to people who hadn't been there. The cold, the arithmetic, the long hours behind the scope, the careful counting of rounds, none of it translated into the kind of story that fit comfortably into the spaces of ordinary conversation. So he didn't tell it. Military historians eventually found it anyway. The engagement at the Ardennes clearing became a case study in infantry sniper employment, taught at training schools as an example of how precision marksmanship could reshape the operational behavior of a numerically superior force. The lesson was not primarily about marksmanship technique, though the technique was studied carefully. The lesson was about the mathematics of disruption, about how a force that cannot predict where accurate fire will come from and cannot safely expose its leadership to coordinate a response becomes a different kind of problem than a force that knows those things. One rifleman had held 300 soldiers in suspension for 9 hours, not because 300 soldiers couldn't overrun one rifleman. They could, and eventually they would have. What Anderson had done was make the cost of finding out higher than the Germans were willing to pay on that particular day in that particular forest, with American artillery closing from the west and the timetable of a strategic offensive that had no room for expensive uncertainty. He had made them think, and while they were thinking, 40 men had stayed alive long enough for the calculation to change. Sometimes the difference between defeat and survival is not an army. Sometimes it is not a superior position, or a fortunate weather change, or a command decision that history will later recognize as inspired. Sometimes it is one man in the snow, behind a rifle he carried against orders, applying 15 years of patience to a problem that everyone else had already decided was unsolvable. One rifleman who understood that the shot is the last thing. Everything before the shot is the work. And who, on a frozen morning in the Ardennes, simply refused to stop working